power has always had a face. Long before modern politics, before mass media and public relations, rulers understood that authority wasn't just enforced through armies. It was performed. A king's portrait wasn't just art. It was propaganda. An emperor's grand entrance wasn't just ceremony. It was psychological warfare. Humanity has always needed symbols, myths, and heroes to make sense of chaos. And out of that instinct came one of the most dangerous political inventions of the modern age, the cult of personality. But the modern version, industrialized, weaponized, and psychologically engineered, truly erupted in the 20th century. And the man who perfected it was Joseph Stalin. What makes Stalin's rise so fascinating isn't just the brutality we associate with his regime, it's the contradiction. He wasn't charismatic. Not by any normal standard. He wasn't a fiery speaker like Hitler. He wasn't flamboyant like Mussolini. He didn't have Kennedy's charm or Reagan's Hollywood polish. If anything, Stalin was ordinary, quiet, calculating, almost invisible in a room full of powerful men. And yet, he became the center of a political universe so vast and so emotionally charged that millions sang his praises with religious devotion. To understand how that happened, you have to understand the moment he seized. Russia in the aftermath of the 1917 revolution was not a stable country finding its footing. It was a shattered empire trying not to implode. Economic collapse, civil war, famine, border conflicts, administrative chaos. The system was fragile. Leadership mattered, and not just politically. Psychologically, people needed someone to believe in. Someone who symbolized stability, control, and destiny. Stalin saw that weakness clearly, and where other revolutionaries argued over ideology, he quietly positioned himself as the custodian of Lenin's legacy. When Lenin died in 1924, Stalin didn't take power with a dramatic coup. He outmaneuvered. He waited. He built alliances in the shadows and destroyed rivals piece by piece. And while he did this, the myth-building machinery began. He made himself seem indispensable, inevitable. Newspapers described him as humble yet brilliant. Schools taught children that he was Lenin's chosen heir. Workers marched under banners with his portrait. His image multiplied across the country. Not accidentally, but with terrifying precision. And here's the secret. The cult worked not because Stalin was adored, but because he made himself unavoidable. You couldn't enter a school, a factory, a government office, or a public square without meeting his gaze. You couldn't read a newspaper without seeing his name in bold. His speeches weren't just printed, they were interpreted as sacred texts. Over time, the public didn't just see a leader, they saw a symbol, order, strength, destiny. Stalin didn't need to be charismatic, the myth did the work for him. If Stalin manipulated devotion through repetition and fear, Mussolini weaponized performance. Where Stalin hid behind institutions and propaganda networks, Mussolini stepped into the spotlight. Italy in the 1920s wasn't looking for quiet efficiency. They wanted identity, energy, pride. Mussolini gave them theater. He loved the stage. He loved the uniform, the balcony, the spotlight. The Italian fascist project was a spectacle, choreographed down to the last gesture. He didn't just speak, he posed. The hands-on-hip stance, the dramatic head tilt, the powerful stride. Mussolini understood something crucial. People don't follow politicians, they follow performances. And if you make the performance big enough, dramatic enough, emotionally charged enough, the audience will believe the story. Stalin perfected myth. Mussolini perfected showmanship. Then came Hitler, who fused both into something unprecedented. Hitler didn't just lead Germany, he represented it. His image wasn't optional. It was the core identity of the Nazi state. The Nazi rallies weren't political events. They were emotional baptisms. Participants didn't leave with opinions, they left with purpose. Hitler offered not just policies, but belonging. He sold meaning. He sold destiny. And that's the terrifying formula behind every successful cult of personality, a leader who promises to complete the identity of a nation. Fear, hope, desperation, these emotions made the soil fertile. But spectacle, storytelling, and repetition made the myth grow. Leaders became symbols not because they were great, but because they filled a psychological void. People wanted clarity in chaos, direction in uncertainty, unity in division. And leaders who understood this, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, built systems where devotion wasn't just encouraged, it was mandatory. To disagree wasn't political, it was heresy. The frightening part, millions complied willingly, because humans crave narratives. We crave heroes and enemies. We crave someone who can simplify a complicated world into a clean, moral, emotionally satisfying story. And when a leader becomes that story, questioning them feels like questioning reality itself. But the cult of personality wasn't confined to dictatorships. Around the world, democratic societies began discovering the same psychological truth. Image matters more than ideology. Policies can be debated. Myths are believed. That shift is crucial because as the 20th century progressed, new technologies amplified charisma to a scale unimaginable before. Radio brought leaders' voices into homes. Film magnified their presence. Television turned politicians into celebrities. And in this new arena, personality became not just an asset, but a weapon. Kennedy's charm, Reagan's Hollywood timing. Leaders who mastered the medium shaped public perception just as effectively as the old dictators, though with different incentives and consequences. By the time the Cold War ended, the cult of personality wasn't a relic of the past. It had evolved. It had become subtler, more polished, less obviously authoritarian, but no less influential. And that evolution is where modern politics begins. But before we enter the era of social media, viral charisma, and the rise of political celebrity worship, we must understand the foundation laid by men like Stalin, leaders who understood that controlling the narrative means controlling the people, and that a powerful image can outlive any policy, institution, or political movement. The cult of personality didn't die with the dictators of the past. It simply changed shape. It learned to smile. It learned to perform. It learned to entertain. The strange thing about the cult of personality is that once it starts, it becomes nearly impossible to stop. It doesn't fade with time. It evolves, shapeshifts, grows roots in institutions and culture, and becomes something bigger than the leader who created it. Stalin may have mastered its darker mechanics, but the world quickly realized something he already knew. Devotion is a resource, and myth-making, that's an industry. After the 1930s, the idea of the leader as a symbol spread like wildfire across continents. Countries emerging from colonialism, nations rebuilding after war, territories struggling with identity crises, all found themselves drawn to strong figures who promised clarity. And clarity is addictive. When societies feel fractured, a leader who looks decisive starts to look divine. That's the foundation of the modern cult, not just power, but the illusion of stability wrapped around a single face. It didn't matter if a leader was benevolent, manipulative, democratic, authoritarian, or something in between. The formula applied everywhere: a compelling presence, a crisis, and a narrative that turned an individual into an embodiment of national hope. That's why so many movements across the 20th century latched on to charismatic figures. People wanted icons, not policy papers. They wanted salvation, not spreadsheets. And the leaders understood this. They crafted images intentionally. Mao, for example, wasn't just a revolutionary. He became an oracle. The Little Red Book wasn't a manual. It was scripture. Every page reinforced the idea that Mao wasn't simply guiding China. He was shaping destiny. The cult became a living organism. His sayings, his portraits, his revolutionary aura became part of daily life. People didn't just follow Mao. They synchronized their entire worldview around him. But Mao wasn't alone. Leaders in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America followed similar arcs. Some genuinely believed they were chosen. Others acted the part because they understood the psychology. A country with deep social fissures is fertile ground for a leader who promises unity, even if that unity is built on exaggerated myths. Narratives of national rebirth, pride, sacrifice, and shared struggle become emotional anchors. And once emotions take hold, logic can pack its bags and leave. This is where things get interesting. The cult of personality isn't sustained by government alone. It's carried by culture. Songs, poetry, school books, festivals, ceremonies, the entire creative engine of a society becomes part of the myth. Once that happens, criticizing the leader isn't just dissent, it becomes sacrilege, and people fear social exile even more than political punishment. Meanwhile, technology kept leveling up. Stalin had newspapers, radio, and tightly curated photography. Hitler had radio domination, film propaganda, and massive stadium rituals. But the next generations of leaders had something even more powerful: television. Suddenly, charisma wasn't just heard, it was seen. A camera could turn a politician into a household presence. It's hard to distrust someone you see in your living room every day. Television softened edges, humanized flaws, and made political power feel personal. Look at Kennedy. His charm didn't just win debates, it created a brand. He was youth, ambition, elegance, hope. Every image of him reinforced the narrative of a modern America. His televised presence was a masterclass in soft power, precise, emotional, relatable. It wasn't propaganda in the traditional sense, but it followed the same script. People weren't following a politician, they were following a persona. And personas are incredibly hard to resist. Reagan followed similar patterns. A trained performer, he understood lighting, pacing, tone. He turned politics into theater, and audiences loved it. His optimism wasn't just policy messaging. It was storytelling woven into a national identity. The cult didn't need statues or mandatory parades. It worked through familiarity and parasocial intimacy. People trusted him because he felt like someone they knew. This shift matters. It shows how the cult of personality adapted to different environments. In authoritarian regimes, it thrived on fear and forced loyalty. In democracies, it thrived on charm, relatability, and emotional storytelling. Different tools, same psychology. Humans connect with faces, stories, and perceived authenticity, and leaders exploited that with increasing sophistication. By the late 20th century, the formula had become efficient. The narrative no longer needed to be grandiose. It could be subtle, media-driven, packaged as patriotism, optimism, stability, or authenticity. A leader didn't need to be flawless. They just needed to be symbolic. Even scandals could be spun into emotional narratives of resilience, persecution, or misunderstood greatness. Myths became more flexible, more adaptable. And then came the internet, the biggest plot twist yet. Suddenly, leaders no longer needed state machinery to build a cult. They had direct access to millions. Tweets, viral clips, live streams, these became the new rallies, the new radio broadcasts, the new posters. Leaders didn't have to go through journalists. They could bypass the entire system and speak directly to the public. Some used it to strengthen democracy. Others used it to carve out their own digital kingdoms. The modern online cult of personality is faster, louder, and more chaotic. Instead of state-sanctioned propaganda departments, you have fan armies, influencers, meme pages, loyal commentators, and algorithm-driven echo chambers. People don't just follow leaders, they participate in building the myth. They defend, amplify, reinterpret, remix, and weaponize narratives in real time. Even misinformation becomes fuel for loyalty. Outrage becomes engagement. Engagement becomes visibility. Visibility becomes power. And nobody illustrates this shift better than Donald Trump. He didn't design a cult of personality in the old-fashioned sense. He engineered a digital one, spontaneous, emotional, meme-driven, and extremely polarized. Every tweet was a rally cry. Every controversy was a chapter. Every supporter felt like part of a movement, not an audience. Trump showed the 21st century version of the cult, not a top-down myth, but a crowd-sourced one. Raw, messy, addictive. This is the world we live in now. A global landscape where leaders aren't just politicians, they're brands, characters, symbols, and influencers. The cult of personality didn't die. It evolved into the algorithmic era. It became faster, harder to regulate, harder to resist, and its psychological hooks are stronger because they feel personal. Leaders appear on your phone like friends. Their voice pops up between messages from your family. Their narratives slide into your feed between jokes and cat videos. Intimacy and propaganda merge into one. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Humans haven't changed. We still crave certainty, identity, belonging, heroes, and stories. The technology changed, but our psychology is the same. That's why the cult of personality continues to thrive, because people don't just want leaders, they want meaning. And a powerful narrative tied to a powerful figure gives them exactly that. Chapter 1 ends here, but the story's only beginning. The next chapters take this foundation and connect it to modern warfare of influence, viral politics, performative leadership, influencer presidents, algorithmic charisma, and the new digital cults quietly shaping the world. Let's rewind to mid-20th century China, a country breaking apart and rebuilding itself at the same time. Picture a place where warlords rule different regions. Villages are starving, and political systems collapse faster than they can be replaced. The old imperial order is dead, and everyone's asking the same question. Who's going to fix this? Who's going to make China whole again? Enter Mao Zedong, a man who didn't just want to win a revolution, he wanted to reshape reality itself. Mao wasn't content with politics or policies, he was after total belief. To him, revolution wasn't a phase, it was a lifestyle, a psychology, a religion of loyalty. When Mao took power in 1949, he didn't walk into a functioning state, he walked into chaos. Millions were poor, the countryside was wrecked, and foreign powers were watching, waiting for China to fail. But Mao had something they didn't. A story of rebirth, of resistance, of purity through struggle. And that story needed a face. His. So began one of the most ambitious image-building projects in modern history. Mao understood something timeless. Power isn't just about control, it's about connection. He knew that if he could make people feel his presence everywhere, he wouldn't have to be physically present at all. Posters, newspapers, murals, and songs, every channel carried his face and his words. He became more than a man. He became an idea. The father of the nation. The helmsman steering China through its storms. The embodiment of revolution itself. And here's the thing, Mao wasn't naturally charismatic in the movie star sense. His speeches were long, dense, sometimes meandering. But charisma isn't always about charm. Sometimes it's about control. Mao's charisma came from context. He appeared as the man who had delivered victory after decades of humiliation. When you rescue a nation from collapse, people don't just follow you, they worship you. But worship doesn't happen automatically. It needs structure, symbols, and repetition. Mao and his party built an entire ecosystem around his image. State media became a machine of adoration. Painters, writers, and filmmakers were instructed not to depict Mao as human, but as heroic, visionary, radiant. You didn't draw wrinkles, you drew wisdom. You didn't show flaws, you showed destiny. Even his handwriting became sacred. Citizens copied his calligraphy like scripture, convinced that his pen strokes carried political virtue. It's wild, right? But it worked.
The repetition, the iconography, the sense that Mao was everywhere and nowhere at once, all of it transformed daily life into a ritual of loyalty. And this is where fear crept in. Not the overt terror of Stalin's purges, at least not yet, but the soft fear of exclusion. If everyone around you is praising Mao, if every wall bears his face, if every song sings his name, can you really afford to be the one who doesn't join in? Conformity became survival. The cult didn't need to be forced, it became socially contagious. That's the subtle brilliance of Mao's rise. He didn't just rule a country, he ruled the emotional bandwidth of 1 billion people. Fast forward to the 1960s, Mao is still in power, but his grip on the narrative is slipping. After the catastrophic Great Leap Forward, where his industrial and agricultural policies caused one of the deadliest famines in history, his aura of infallibility starts to crack. Critics emerge inside the Communist Party. The myth is wobbling. So what does Mao do? He reboots it. The result, the Cultural Revolution, a nationwide campaign not just to reshape politics, but to rewire minds. And the core of that reboot was simple: turn ideology into emotion. The little red book becomes the cultural iPhone of its time. Everyone's carrying it, quoting it, waving it in the air like it's sacred. Officially titled Quotations from Chairman Mao Zedong, it wasn't just a book, it was a badge of loyalty. People memorized it, preached it, and used it to judge one another's purity. Forget religion, this was Maoism 24/7. The power of that little red symbol was insane. Think of it as the first viral content before the internet. People competed to show who loved Mao more. Villages would hold loyalty dances, waving the book while shouting his quotes. Workers would hang his portrait in factories like a lucky charm. Students would carry it like a moral compass. And just like that, devotion became public theater. Loyalty wasn't something you felt quietly. It was something you performed. The louder your praise, the safer you were. The more fanatical your enthusiasm, the higher your social standing. Enter the Red Guards. Millions of young people who treated Mao like a living god and took it upon themselves to purify society. They destroyed temples, tore down old books, humiliated intellectuals, and attacked enemies of the revolution. For them, this wasn't cruelty, it was righteousness. They genuinely believed they were carrying out Mao's will, cleansing China of corruption. It's chilling, but it's also fascinating. Mao didn't have to command every act of violence. The cult did the work for him. His image was so ingrained in their consciousness that people acted on his perceived desires without needing orders. That's the ultimate form of control, when your followers enforce your ideology spontaneously. And here's the dark paradox. Mao's cult wasn't sustained just by fear. It was sustained by faith. People loved him even as his policies devastated their lives. They rationalized the suffering as part of a higher purpose. Mao knows best, they'd say. If things are hard, it must be for the revolution. That's not just propaganda, that's psychological conditioning on a mass scale. You could see it everywhere. His portraits hung in every home, his name began every meeting, his words ended every argument. When he smiled from a poster, it wasn't decoration. It was surveillance, wrapped in symbolism. And the Cultural Revolution made sure of one thing. Mao was the only lens through which reality could be interpreted. Art, education, history, they all got rewritten. Artists painted Mao with halos of sunlight. School books described him as the red sun in our hearts. And journalists wrote stories where even nature obeyed his will. And this is where Mao's cult transcended politics and entered the realm of the divine. Stalin was feared. Hitler was worshipped, but Mao was loved. Or at least people thought they loved him because the system didn't give them room to feel anything else. By the late 1960s, Mao had built what can only be described as a parallel reality. Facts were flexible, memory was malleable, and truth was whatever the chairman said it was. The machinery of worship was so well-oiled that even when famine, violence, and chaos engulfed the country, people believed they were witnessing progress. But even myths decay. After Mao's death in 1976, the emotional scaffolding started to crumble. The state began acknowledging the disasters of his rule, but it couldn't completely disown him. Why? Because Mao wasn't just a leader, he was the foundation of the modern Chinese state's identity. You can't delete the architect without shaking the building. So instead, the narrative shifted. Mao became a complex icon, part revolutionary hero, part tragic cautionary tale. But his cult didn't disappear. It mutated. His portrait still hangs in Tiananmen Square. His face still decorates currency. His image still appears in art and film. The machinery of worship he built became a template for others. From Kim Il-sung in North Korea to various leaders across Africa and Asia. And that's the thing about personality cults. Once the infrastructure of devotion is built, it's almost impossible to dismantle. You can tear down statues, but the mindset, the habit of linking leadership with holiness, sticks around. Mao showed the world how to industrialize adoration. He turned propaganda into poetry, politics into pop culture, obedience into emotion. His cult wasn't just about loyalty, it was about identity construction on a civilizational scale. People didn't simply follow Mao, they became Maoists, psychologically, socially, and culturally. Let's talk about what's happening beneath the surface. The psychology of it all. Why did millions of people buy into this? Part of it is fear, sure, but it's deeper than that. Humans crave certainty. In chaotic times, a single voice promising order feels comforting. When society's falling apart, ideology feels like oxygen. Mao offered that. He took chaos and turned it into meaning. He told people their suffering was noble, that their sacrifices were shaping history. And when you give people a sense of purpose, especially collective purpose, they'll endure almost anything. That's why the cult survived even the worst tragedies. Another part of it? Belonging. Being part of Mao's China meant being part of a story bigger than yourself. You weren't just a farmer or a factory worker, you were a revolutionary soldier in the great march toward utopia. You mattered. And that's an intoxicating feeling, especially after decades of war and humiliation. But there's a darker twist. The cult turned morality upside down. It made cruelty righteous. Denouncing your teacher, attacking your neighbor, humiliating your parents, all could be reframed as acts of loyalty. That's what makes personality cults so dangerous. They hijack morality, turning devotion into justification. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the mental gymnastics people perform to align their beliefs with their actions. When citizens participated in violence, they didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as purifiers, heroes even. The cult gave them that narrative. And once you're emotionally invested, it's almost impossible to back out. To admit Mao was wrong would mean admitting you destroyed lives for nothing. So people doubled down, even as the evidence piled up. Here's the legacy part, the reason Mao's story still matters today. He didn't just shape China, he shaped how future leaders understood media manipulation and emotional politics. Mao proved that devotion could be manufactured, that ideology could be turned into lifestyle, and that a leader's image could replace the idea of truth itself. Sound familiar? It should, because the same playbook shows up decades later, in North Korea, in parts of Africa, in modern populist movements around the world. The tools have changed, posters turned into tweets, rallies into live streams, but the psychology? Exactly the same. Mao was the blueprint for how to scale loyalty in the modern age. He built the prototype of a nation where the leader's face was both brand and belief system. And maybe that's why his cult still haunts the collective imagination. It reminds us that power isn't just about what a leader does, it's about what people feel when they look at them. It's emotional engineering on a national scale. In the end, Mao's cult wasn't just a political strategy. It was a masterclass in human psychology. He took pain and turned it into purpose. He turned obedience into passion. And he proved that the most powerful empires aren't built with armies or laws. They're built in the minds of the people who believe. The Cold War wasn't just about nuclear weapons, space races, or spies. It was a global competition for loyalty, faith, and myth. Both sides, East and West, understood that power wasn't just about armies or money. It was about belief. And no one weaponized belief quite like the leaders who turned themselves into living deities within their borders. At the heart of this phenomenon was one man, Kim Il-sung, the founding leader of North Korea. When World War II ended and the Korean peninsula split along the 38th parallel, Kim saw more than just a new nation emerging. He saw an opportunity to engineer a faith system where he wasn't just a ruler, he was the embodiment of the revolution itself. In the years following 1948, the North Korean state began crafting an identity that revolved entirely around Kim. It started subtly, his portraits in classrooms, his name in patriotic songs, but soon spiraled into something cosmic. Children were taught that Kim Il-sung had single-handedly liberated Korea from Japanese oppression. He wasn't described as a man who fought in a war. He was depicted as a divine protector who descended to rescue his people. While the world was divided between capitalism and communism, North Korea created a third ideology, Juche, a self-reliance doctrine that claimed to reject both Western imperialism and Soviet dependency. But Juche was never truly about economics or politics. It was about control. It turned loyalty to the state into worship of its leader. Kim Il-sung was not a leader of the people. He was the people. By the 1960s, North Korea had perfected what Stalin started, an ecosystem of reverence. Statues towered above cities, slogans screamed from every wall, and citizens carried loyalty pledges as personal testaments of faith. Every birthday, wedding, and public event began with oaths to Kim. He was immortalized in poems, painted as a sun, literally the eternal son of mankind. In Western eyes, this looked absurd. But for those living inside the sealed world of the DPRK, it became the only truth that existed. Information control was absolute, and collective psychology turned obedience into instinct. In a world without comparison, myth became a reality. North Korea didn't invent the cult, it inherited it. Kim Il-sung was a student of both Stalin's stagecraft and Mao's populist theater. Stalin used propaganda to turn fear into awe. Mao used revolution to make obedience feel righteous. Kim fused both. From Stalin, he borrowed the architecture of intimidation, omnipresent portraits, rewritten history books, and purges that made loyalty the only survival tactic. From Mao, he stole the theater of mass participation, synchronized rallies, choreographed adoration, and the illusion that the leader's power was drawn from the people's love. But Kim took it one step further. He turned family into a political concept. When Kim Jong-il, his son, began appearing in public ceremonies in the 1970s, North Koreans didn't question the hereditary transition. They accepted it as natural, divine even, because their nation had already been framed as one family under the benevolent father Kim Il-sung. This blending of kinship and ideology made the cult self-sustaining. You weren't just betraying a ruler if you questioned Kim. You were betraying your father. Disloyalty became sin, and sin was punishable not just by death, but by erasure. 3 generations of your family could vanish from history. Outside North Korea, other Cold War states mirrored aspects of the strategy, though with varying degrees of intensity. In Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu turned himself and his wife Elena into quasi-monarchs of socialism. Their faces filled postage stamps, songs praised their intellect, and entire parades were choreographed to worship them as geniuses of the revolution. In Albania, Enver Hoxha followed a similar path, declaring his nation the purest form of socialism, free from Soviet revisionism and Western decadence. But behind his slogans of purity lay a system of paranoia, bunkers, and surveillance that turned fear into faith. The leader's omnipresence was justified as protection. Across Eastern Europe and Asia, the pattern was unmistakable. A closed media environment, ritualized devotion, and the substitution of ideology with the personality of the man at the top. The cult wasn't an accident, it was a survival mechanism. If Stalin and Mao built their myths through propaganda and terror, North Korea refined the art through ritual and repetition. The regime understood that a personality cult isn't just sustained by fear, it's sustained by daily performance. Every North Korean child grows up reciting poems dedicated to Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. From the first day of school, they learn not just history, but the story, the legend of how the Kims saved the nation, fed the people, and stood defiant against the world's bullies. The classroom isn't a place of education, it's a place of indoctrination. Art follows the same pattern. In paintings, Kim Il-sung is always bathed in golden light. His smile is radiant, his hand always raised in benevolent blessing. Film, theater, and even opera, all state-sponsored, celebrate him as the central character of every moral universe. Heroes in fiction succeed because they embody Kim's teachings. Villains fail because they betray his ideals. Monuments serve as the physical anchors of faith. The Mansudaim Grand Monument in Pyongyang, with its 22-meter bronze statue of Kim Il-sung, isn't just a sculpture, it's a shrine. Citizens bow before it on national holidays, weddings, and even before traveling abroad. The act of bowing isn't symbolic, it's devotional. Music, too, plays a crucial role. State songs like "We Will Defend the General with Our Lives" become sacred hymns. Marching bands, synchronized dancers, and youth choirs perform them in mass spectacles designed to blur individuality into collective emotion. In North Korea, art doesn't imitate life, it enforces obedience. Creativity isn't about expression, it's about repetition. Every stroke of a brush or note of a song is an act of loyalty, and through that loyalty, the myth of Kim Il-sung becomes eternal. After Kim Il-sung's death in 1994, the world predicted collapse. How could a system so tied to one man survive his death? But the regime didn't crumble. It adapted. Kim Jong-il, his son, stepped in, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. North Korean ideology rebranded Kim Il-sung as the eternal president, ensuring he remained symbolically alive. Kim Jong-il positioned himself as the dear leader, the spiritual heir tasked with fulfilling his father's vision. This wasn't succession, it was resurrection. State propaganda didn't mourn Kim Il-sung's death, it celebrated his ascension into eternity. Paintings began to depict him surrounded by sunlight and clouds, as if he had become a celestial being. Every public speech reinforced that the father of the nation was still guiding the people, now from the heavens. Kim Jong-il, in turn, mastered the cinematic dimension of propaganda. A known film enthusiast, he understood the power of storytelling. Under his rule, North Korean propaganda became more dramatic, more emotional, more theatrical. The country's mythology was no longer just political, it was cinematic. By the time Kim Jong-un took power in 2011, the cult had become generational. The grandson of the eternal president was branded the great successor, blending youth with destiny. Within months, the state had rewritten narratives to make his leadership seem preordained. His resemblance to Kim Il-sung, physically and stylistically, was amplified to evoke nostalgia and continuity. The cult had completed its evolution from man to myth to dynasty. North Korea had become not just a dictatorship, but a monarchy of ideology, where the divine right to rule came not from heaven, but from history itself. While North Korea remains the most extreme example, the psychology of personality worship spread globally during the Cold War. Leaders realized that myth-making was as valuable as military power. In Cuba, Fidel Castro became the face of defiance against U.S. imperialism.
His image, bearded, cigar in hand, became a global symbol of revolutionary cool. Unlike Kim or Stalin, Castro's cult relied less on isolation and more on charisma. He wasn't portrayed as divine, but as immortal in purpose. In Yugoslavia, Josip Broz Tito cultivated his own blend of socialist monarchy. His face was on every billboard, his birthday a national holiday. He managed to unite a multi-ethnic federation through sheer mythic authority, until his death shattered the illusion. In Indonesia, Sukarno fused nationalism, religion, and personal magnetism to cast himself as the father of the nation. His downfall revealed the truth echoed throughout the Cold War era. Once the myth cracks, it collapses quickly. Even in the United States, the Cold War saw subtler forms of myth-making. Presidents like John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan were framed not just as leaders, but as symbols: youth, hope, freedom. The tools were different, but the mechanism, the transformation of individuals into icons, was eerily familiar. By the end of the 20th century, the world had changed, but the logic of the personality cult hadn't vanished. It had evolved. The tools of worship had shifted from statues and parades to television and the internet, but the psychology was timeless. North Korea stands today as a living museum of the Cold War cult. It shows what happens when a nation becomes a stage, and its citizens lifelong actors in a play they didn't write. Kim Il-sung's portrait still watches over Pyongyang. His statues still dominate the skyline. Children still learn songs written before their grandparents were born. But the idea behind it all, the belief that one man can embody an entire nation's soul, didn't die with Stalin or Mao or Kim Il-sung. It merely adapted to new technologies, new ideologies, and new audiences. The Cold War may have ended, but its gods never truly fell. They live on, in murals, in speeches, and in the psychology of power itself. The line between leader and legend remains dangerously thin. And in the 21st century, with social media and global polarization, the tools to build new myths are more powerful than ever. The cult of personality didn't end. It just went online. By the time the smoke of the Second World War had cleared, the West was standing on the edge of a new battlefield, not one fought with tanks or artillery, but with lenses, microphones, and television screens. Power was no longer only about military might or ideological control. It was about visibility, about how well a leader could live inside the minds and living rooms of millions. In the 1950s and 60s, the political landscape of the United States transformed into a theater. The stage was lit not by torches or rallies, but by the glow of cathode ray screens. This was the dawn of media charisma, a subtle yet revolutionary shift in how the public connected with authority. Where Stalin had ruled through fear and omnipresence, the new Western icons ruled through fascination, trust, and aspiration. They didn't command worship, they invited it. Enter John Fitzgerald Kennedy, young, articulate, photogenic, the very embodiment of post-war optimism. Kennedy's rise was perfectly timed with the birth of television as the world's most powerful medium. His image wasn't just seen, it was curated. The smile, the confidence, the effortless elegance, it all translated perfectly through the lens. He wasn't the general behind the desk, he was the hero in motion, the voice of a new era. The 1960 presidential debates between Kennedy and Richard Nixon marked the beginning of the visual age of politics. Those who listened on radio thought Nixon had won. Calm, experienced, factual. But those who watched on television saw something else entirely. Kennedy looked poised, polished, presidential. Nixon, sweating under the studio lights, seemed nervous, even shifty. In that moment, perception overpowered content.
The screen had chosen its first global icon. What made Kennedy's charisma so potent wasn't just presentation, it was myth-making. He symbolized a generational handover, from the black and white austerity of the 1950s to the vibrant hues of a decade that promised change. His speeches blended intellect with idealism. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was rhythm, poetry in policy form. Kennedy turned civic duty into a personal calling. But behind the charisma was strategy. Every photograph was intentional. The casual images of him sailing off Cape Cod, playing football with his family, or walking hand in hand with Jackie weren't candid accidents. They were calculated symbols. Kennedy wasn't just selling policies. He was selling presence. And presence, in the age of television, was power. The Kennedy myth deepened after his assassination in 1963. Death immortalized him. The unfinished promise of his presidency transformed into a narrative, as Camelot, as his widow Jackie framed it, a modern fairy tale of American idealism. In death, Kennedy became untouchable, not as a politician, but as a symbol of youth, courage, and charisma. The cult of personality had evolved, no longer enforced by fear, but preserved through longing. The years that followed witnessed a paradox. While the West prided itself on freedom of expression, its political systems began to orbit around personality just as much as policy. Leaders were now expected to perform, to embody national mood, to feel relatable, yet larger than life. The machinery of media was not about control anymore, it was about crafting illusion. Television demanded simplicity. Complex policies didn't translate well through screens. What did translate were faces, tones, and vibes. And so leaders learned to become performers. Political consultants became directors, speechwriters became screenwriters, and campaign ads became trailers for a national story. The transformation wasn't limited to America. Across Europe, leaders like Charles de Gaulle and Winston Churchill understood the weight of voice and image. Churchill's gravelly defiance on radio during the war had already proved that tone could rally nations. De Gaulle's televised addresses in post-war France combined stoic authority with visual drama. The medium had changed, the principle had not. Leadership was performance, now illuminated, amplified, and edited for mass consumption. By the late 1960s and 70s, the line between entertainment and governance blurred further. Richard Nixon, who once lost a debate to the power of aesthetics, returned to power by mastering that very art, hiring public relations teams, staging photo ops, and appealing to emotion over logic. Yet the Watergate scandal revealed the dark underbelly of image politics. The more curated the persona, the greater the fall when the illusion cracks. If Kennedy was the first cinematic politician, Ronald Reagan was the first movie president, literally and figuratively. His career had begun in front of the camera, but his legacy would be built behind it, scripting an era where charisma was currency and optimism was ideology. By the time Reagan entered the political arena, America was exhausted. The 1970s had brought economic turmoil, Vietnam's trauma, and the disillusionment of Watergate. The national mood was fractured, uncertain, cynical, and searching for something or someone to believe in. Reagan, with his easy charm and reassuring voice, filled that void. He didn't speak like a bureaucrat. He spoke like a storyteller. He made politics feel human again. Reagan's genius lay in understanding the narrative of leadership. His speeches were not lectures, they were scenes. When he declared, "It's morning again in America," it wasn't policy, it was poetry crafted for television. He cast himself as the optimistic father figure, guiding the nation from doubt to renewal. Every gesture, every smile, every pause, rehearsed, yet authentic enough to feel spontaneous. Unlike totalitarian leaders who demanded devotion, Reagan inspired affection. His was a soft cult of personality, built not on fear, but on familiarity. He embodied the American dream, the self-made man, the Hollywood cowboy turned savior of democracy. For millions, he wasn't just president, he was a character in the collective imagination, reassuring, dependable, and larger than life. Reagan's team perfected the marriage between politics and image management. They controlled lighting at press conferences, coordinated camera angles, and pre-approved backdrops for every speech. The media didn't just report on Reagan, it amplified him. His administration was aware that every lens could turn into a mirror reflecting the myth they wanted the world to see. But the deeper brilliance and danger of Reagan's charisma was how it reframed ideology. Conservatism became not merely policy-driven, but emotionally charged. Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. The line stuck not because of its logic, but because of its rhythm, its cinematic simplicity. Reagan's communication turned philosophy into feeling. Across the Atlantic, leaders like Margaret Thatcher mirrored this shift. She too understood the theater of power, the visual authority of posture, wardrobe, and timing. Thatcher's Iron Lady persona wasn't just an insult reclaimed, it was branding. She, like Reagan, recognized that charisma in the modern world required storytelling, not to deceive, but to define. By the 1980s, the West had perfected the illusion of choice within a media-saturated democracy. The cults of personality in these societies were voluntary. Voters wanted to believe in the myth because it felt personal, participatory, and aspirational. The manipulation was subtler, but no less real. Leaders became reflections of collective emotion, projecting the dreams and anxieties of their people back at them. The difference between Stalin's portrait and Reagan's televised smile was one of medium, but not of method. Both crafted personas designed to evoke loyalty, but while Stalin demanded submission, Reagan invited consent. Both blurred the line between individual and institution. Both turned leadership into theater. The rise of televised politics also laid the foundation for what would come next, the digital age of instant myth-making. The charisma economy that began with Kennedy's confident grin and Reagan's cinematic optimism would evolve into a world where every leader, influencer, or populist could broadcast directly to millions without filters, without mediation. The camera that once crowned presidents now belonged to everyone. As the 20th century closed, Western democracies found themselves trapped in a paradox. The same freedom of speech that allowed open debate also amplified personality over principle. The public, saturated by images, began to equate familiarity with trustworthiness. To be seen was to be believed. Authenticity became performative. Sincerity became strategy. But yet, beneath all the spectacle, the human craving remained the same. The desire to believe in someone who could make sense of chaos, embody hope, and narrate meaning. The cult of personality had not disappeared in the Western democracies. It had simply changed costume. The banners were replaced with broadcast signals, and devotion was now disguised as admiration. Kennedy's televised confidence, Reagan's cinematic optimism, they were different expressions of the same truth. Charisma is timeless, adaptable, and dangerously seductive. It softens ideology, disguises power, and makes leadership feel intimate, even when it isn't. As the credits rolled on the 20th century, the Western world stood on the cusp of another transformation, one that would take these cinematic foundations and digitize them. A new generation of leaders would no longer just perform for the camera, they would live inside it. The next chapter wouldn't belong to television presidents or Hollywood cowboys, but to those who mastered the algorithmic stage, where charisma could be coded, broadcast, and multiplied endlessly. Because in the end, whether through a Soviet mural or a presidential campaign ad, the cult of personality is not about the leader. It's about us. Our hunger for symbols, stories, and saviors. The medium changes, the myth remains. By the time the 21st century truly began, the world had grown comfortable with spectacle. Politics had long been televised, rehearsed, branded, and polished. But the digital age changed everything, and then changed it again.
The rise of social media shattered the boundaries between public and private, truth and narrative, authority and performance. It was no longer enough to appear presidential. In a world scrolling endlessly, leaders had to be viral. Populism, the old art of channeling the people against the elite, found new life in the digital bloodstream. Its rhetoric wasn't new, but its reach was unprecedented. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube became the new town squares and the new battlegrounds. Memes replaced manifestos. Outrage replaced debate. Every swipe, like, and share became a microvote for identity, not ideology. And in this chaotic, hyper-connected landscape emerged a figure who embodied the age perfectly: Donald J. Trump. Trump didn't invent digital populism, but he weaponized it. A billionaire with the instincts of a showman, he understood the attention economy better than any politician alive. He didn't adapt to the digital stage, he owned it. His every tweet was a declaration, a headline, a provocation. Traditional media, the very institutions he called fake, couldn't look away. By mocking them, he controlled them. By antagonizing elites, he crowned himself as the anti-elite. He wasn't reading from the old political script, he was improvising live, in front of millions. Trump's rallies became performances, unscripted, emotional, almost ritualistic. He wasn't delivering policy, he was delivering catharsis. Every cheer, every chant of "lock her up" or "build the wall" was an echo chamber of anger and belonging. He made his supporters feel seen, not as citizens, but as a movement. That was the genius and danger of modern populism. It doesn't sell plans, it sells emotion. The same emotional contract that bound Stalin's subjects through fear or Reagan's supporters through hope now bound Trump's base through resentment. The narrative wasn't, "I will fix the system," it was, "You and I are fighting them." It turned politics into tribal identity, and in an era where algorithms amplify outrage, anger became both message and medium. Trump's rise in 2016 wasn't an accident. It was the logical next step in a century-long evolution of the cult of personality. He took the aesthetics of celebrity, immediacy, relatability, dominance, and injected them into governance. His campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," wasn't policy. It was nostalgia wrapped in nationalism, a four-word myth that every follower could project their own fantasy onto. And in the post-truth ecosystem of social media, myth was stronger than fact. Every controversy became content. Every scandal became proof of persecution. Traditional politicians feared bad press. Trump thrived on it. He turned chaos into a campaign strategy. The 24-hour news cycle wasn't his obstacle, it was his oxygen. In the 20th century, the cult of personality was managed by propagandists and state media. In the 21st, it's managed by followers. The crowd now amplifies the leader in real time. Retweets, reactions, and hashtags create the illusion of consensus. The leader doesn't need to enforce loyalty, the algorithm does it for him. And so Trump's cult didn't need statues or parades. It lived in memes, live streams, and timelines. It was participatory, digital, and global. Every supporter could become a soldier in the narrative, every critic an enemy to attack. The boundary between audience and actor dissolved. What made Trump unique wasn't ideology, it was authenticity, or at least the performance of authenticity. He said what others wouldn't, broke norms others feared, and turned offense into proof of strength. In an age of curated perfection, his rawness was refreshing to some, horrifying to others, but captivating to all. To his followers, Trump wasn't a politician. He was an avatar of defiance, the human embodiment of telling it like it is. That's how populist charisma works. It doesn't have to be believable, it just has to feel real. Beneath the spectacle, something deeper was happening. The cult of personality had gone from top-down, broadcast by the state, to bottom-up, crowd-generated and self-reinforcing. The leader doesn't impose belief, he becomes a mirror reflecting the public's grievances, fears, and desires. And the internet, with its infinite mirrors,
made that reflection impossible to escape. Trump's ascent didn't occur in isolation. Around the world, similar figures were rising, each using digital tools to amplify personality over policy, narrative over nuance. Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, Recep Erdogan in Turkey, and others mirrored the formula: a direct connection with the people, bypassing traditional media, blending nationalism with performance. Each cultivated an online persona, relatable, emotional, and combative. Each claimed to represent the real people against corrupt elites or global conspiracies. The populist age was borderless, streaming in high definition across continents. What united them wasn't ideology, it was rhythm. The rhythm of outrage, the cadence of certainty, the spectacle of strength. Trump's brand of charisma thrived in a fractured media landscape, but it also exposed something timeless about human nature. The same psychology that drew millions to Stalin's myth or Kennedy's charm still thrived in the digital age. People seek belonging through belief. The internet didn't destroy personality cults, it democratized them. Everyone now has a platform, a voice, a following. Every influencer, activist, or politician can build a mini-cult of their own, with slogans, loyalists, and enemies. In this sense, Trump was not an outlier, but a pioneer, the first truly algorithmic leader of the modern era. His language was simple, repetitive, emotional, perfect for virality. His communication style didn't follow policy logic, it followed meme logic. In the old days, propaganda required production. Now it requires participation. Followers create, remix, and spread the myth themselves. And yet beneath the noise, something haunting lingers: the erosion of truth. Populism thrives in the gray zone between fact and feeling. Every fact check becomes a challenge to loyalty. Every contradiction strengthens the tribe. The more the establishment resists, the deeper the belief grows. The cult becomes self-sustaining, immune to evidence, insulated by emotion. This, perhaps, is the defining danger of the modern cult of personality. It no longer needs censorship or repression. It thrives in the chaos of too much information. In Trump's America, politics became performance art. Press conferences turned into reality TV. Tweets replaced policy briefings. What mattered wasn't governance, it was engagement. And engagement, by design, rewards outrage. This new charisma doesn't inspire unity, it monetizes division. The digital populist doesn't need to silence dissent, he amplifies it to prove persecution. Every critic becomes a character in his story. Every scandal another season in the show. The 20th century's dictators demanded loyalty through fear. The 21st century's populists earn it through belonging. Their followers don't obey because they must. They participate because they want to. The leader doesn't become less a ruler than a brand, and loyalty becomes lifestyle. The result is a new kind of politics: personal, tribal, perpetual. The campaign never ends. The performance never stops. The leader is always online, always reacting, always visible. The myth renews itself every time someone hits share. And so Trump became more than a man. He became a network, a feedback loop of belief, grievance, and belonging. He symbolized not policy, but defiance itself, the rejection of institutions, the distrust of experts, the triumph of narrative over fact. In the mirror of history, he stands alongside past icons of personality politics, not as a tyrant, but as a showman king of the digital age. His power didn't come from suppression, but saturation. He flooded the culture until distinction between leadership and performance ceased to matter. The cult of personality, reborn in Wi-Fi and hashtags, now lives among us all. It's no longer confined to parliaments or palaces. It exists in followers, fandoms, and movements. Every like is a pledge. Every retweet is an oath. Every algorithm is an altar. The spectacle of politics has become self-aware, and that may be the most dangerous evolution yet. Because when every leader learns to be a performer and every citizen learns to be an audience, truth itself becomes just another role in the show. And as the credits roll on this era of digital charisma, one question remains unanswered. Not who leads, but who we choose to believe. The 21st century was supposed to be the age of enlightenment through technology, a time when information flowed freely, when truth could travel faster than lies, and when democracy, armed with digital transparency, would finally be safe from manipulation. But the opposite happened. The web didn't make us wiser, it made us louder. It didn't bring unity, it built echo chambers. The very platforms designed for connection became the new arenas for division, outrage, and performance. And in this noise, a familiar figure reemerged, not the polished politician or the bureaucratic diplomat, but the showman. The man who understood that in a post-truth world, spectacle beats substance. That man was Donald Trump. Long before his political debut, Trump had already mastered the language of fame. His face wasn't introduced through ballots, but through screens. Reality television didn't just showcase him, it built him. The gold-plated penthouses, the exaggerated gestures, the catchphrases, "You're fired," they weren't just entertainment, they were rehearsals for domination. When Trump descended the golden escalator of Trump Tower in 2015, it wasn't a campaign launch, it was an entrance scene perfectly staged for the world's biggest reality show, democracy itself. What followed wasn't politics as usual, it was a spectacle of emotion, anger, defiance, and nostalgia. Trump didn't offer policies, he offered feelings. He didn't sell plans, he sold belonging. His rallies became rituals, arenas vibrating with chants, red hats, and slogans that blurred into hymns. Make America Great Again wasn't a policy, it was a promise to restore identity. Like every personality cult before it, Trump's movement thrived on contrast, us versus them, the people versus the elite. But unlike Stalin or Mussolini, Trump's army wasn't forged through fear, it was forged through fandom. His supporters didn't just follow him, they performed him. Memes replaced manifestos, tweets replaced treaties. And in this new digital theater, Trump was both actor and director, both myth and man. His unfiltered tone, crude, chaotic, captivating, wasn't a flaw, it was the feature. Every insult became authenticity, every scandal proof of persecution, every ban a badge of honor. Social media didn't just amplify his voice, it translated it into a movement. The algorithm rewarded outrage, and outrage became the language of politics. Trump instinctively knew that in the attention economy, domination isn't about persuasion, it's about volume. Whoever shouts longest owns the narrative. Behind the scenes, populism was mutating. Across continents, figures like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Narendra Modi in India, Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines were rewriting the same script. Emotional politics for an algorithmic age. They all promised to speak for the real people against the corrupt system, and each cultivated a cult, not of fear, but of belonging. But Trump's cult of personality was unique. It wasn't born in the ashes of war or revolution, it was born in the chaos of content. He transformed American populism into a brand, one that could be worn, shared, liked, and retweeted. The image of the leader became an identity product, something millions could consume and internalize. For some, Trump represented rebellion against political correctness, a symbol of speaking one's mind without consequence. For others, he was the embodiment of everything wrong with power, arrogance, greed, moral decay. Yet even his critics became part of the performance. Every outrage fueled the algorithm. Every headline made the myth stronger. In the 20th century, personality cults relied on state-controlled media. In the 21st, they rely on user-generated propaganda. The crowd now participates in building the myth. Each retweet, each comment, each viral clip becomes part of the leader's aura, proof of relevance, validation of dominance. Trump didn't have to silence the media, he only had to drown it. The battle wasn't for truth, it was for attention. By the time Trump entered the White House in 2017, politics had completed its transformation into performance art. Press conferences resembled stand-up routines, policy debates turned into reality show plotlines. Late-night comedy became the new opposition press. The world wasn't watching governance, it was watching content creation at scale. Trump's Twitter account became the modern version of Stalin's portraits or Mao's Little Red Book, a daily scripture of dominance and grievance. His 280-character messages could move markets, enrage opponents, and mobilize millions, all from a phone screen. Every tweet was a proclamation. Every retweet was a loyalty test. The traditional gatekeepers of truth, journalists, scholars, analysts, were replaced by influencers, conspiracy theorists, and meme pages. Truth wasn't verified anymore, it was voted on. And for many, that was liberation. The populist myth works because it feels participatory. Trump supporters believed they were part of something bigger, not mere followers, but warriors in a cultural revolution. When he said fake news, it wasn't just about the media, it was about rewriting reality itself. To question him was to betray the tribe. To defend him was to defend America. It was a perfect feedback loop. Loyalty proved authenticity, and authenticity demanded loyalty. But the deeper psychology at play wasn't new. Every cult of personality thrives on emotional dependency. The leader becomes a mirror for collective frustration and hope. Trump's genius, whether instinctive or strategic, lay in understanding that rage is more viral than reason. He weaponized grievance. Every loss became sabotage. Every scandal became persecution. His myth wasn't about victory, it was about victimhood. He was the billionaire underdog, the outsider besieged by elites, the savior misunderstood by history. And the people believed because belief itself felt like rebellion. The digital landscape amplified this dynamic beyond imagination. Algorithms favor engagement, and nothing engages like outrage. The platforms that were supposed to democratize information instead created hyper-personalized echo chambers. Each user became both consumer and soldier in a digital war of narratives. On platforms like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, political identity became entertainment. Anger became community. The divide between civic duty and fandom collapsed. In the old cults, devotion required rituals, parades, speeches, songs. In the digital cult, it requires posting. Hashtags replace hymns. Memes replace manifestos. The leader's power becomes measured not in votes or laws, but in engagement metrics, likes, views, shares. But yet the story doesn't end with one man. The Trump era revealed a deeper truth about modern populism. It's no longer about ideology, it's about identity performance. The follower and the leader are co-authors of the myth. When Trump left office, many assumed the movement would fade. But cults don't die when the leader falls. They linger in memory, in myth, in digital archives that never forget. Trumpism became a decentralized religion of resentment and belonging. And this is where the cult of personality in the digital age diverges most sharply from its predecessors. Stalin and Mao needed control. Trump and his successors need chaos. Control limits participation. Chaos fuels it. Every scandal spawns memes. Every controversy breeds new converts. Every cancellation confirms persecution. The leader doesn't have to be perfect anymore, he just has to be authentic. In a media environment where perfection feels fake and outrage feels real, imperfection becomes the ultimate proof of honesty. That's why Trump's slips, insults, and contradictions only strengthened his myth. They made him human, or rather hyperhuman. A man who says what others won't, who breaks the rules others fear. But underneath the humor, the spectacle, and the endless scroll lies something darker. Populist cults don't just shape politics, they reshape reality. When a leader becomes a meme, truth becomes negotiable. When politics becomes entertainment, consequences become abstract. Democracy, built on deliberation, cannot survive on dopamine. By 2020, the United States was no longer arguing about policy, it was arguing about reality itself. Elections weren't contests of vision, but tests of faith. The crowd didn't chant for a platform, it chanted for a savior. The storming of the Capitol in January 2021 was the logical conclusion of years of myth-making, the moment when performance became prophecy. The spectacle turned physical, the screen bled into the street, and the world watched, realizing that the cult of personality had found its new cathedral, not in parliaments or party halls, but in timelines and feeds. Across continents, leaders took notes. They saw how outrage could override accountability, how spectacle could substitute governance, how identity could eclipse ideology. The cult of personality had gone global and algorithmic. But beneath the pixels and hashtags lies an ancient truth. People still crave stories. We want heroes and villains, saviors and scapegoats. The platforms just made those myths easier to manufacture, faster to spread, and harder to kill. The tragedy of modern populism isn't that people are deceived, it's that they choose the deception that feels truest to their pain. And as the cameras roll, the tweets fly, and the feeds refresh, one question lingers like static in the digital storm. Was Trump the culmination of the cult of personality or just the beginning of its next evolution? Because if the 20th century's myths were built on marble statues and radio speeches, the 21st century builds them out of pixels and notifications, fleeting, addictive, and omnipresent. And maybe that's the ultimate twist of history. In an age where everyone can broadcast, everyone becomes a little bit of the cult, follower, propagandist, and believer all at once. The leader doesn't command from above anymore. He trends. The story of power has always been a story of people. It is not enough for a leader to issue decrees, to command armies, or to pass laws. History shows that authority truly consolidates when it becomes emotion, when loyalty becomes identity, when followers no longer obey a person but believe in them. From Stalin's omnipresent portraits to Mao's little red book, from Kim Il-sung's monuments to Trump's hashtags, the mechanisms are variations on a single human truth. People crave certainty in a chaotic world. They crave stories that explain, simplify, and justify. They crave heroes who promise to make sense of disorder, and the cult of personality thrives in that craving. Psychologists call it parasocial interaction, the phenomenon of feeling as if you personally know someone you have never met. This ancient wiring, once limited to kings, prophets, and generals, has been turbocharged by modern technology. Televised debates, viral videos, and social media feeds create intimacy at scale. We feel we see our leaders, but what we see is carefully constructed, curated reality designed to evoke trust, admiration, and even fear. This devotion is neither purely voluntary nor purely coerced. It is a contract between emotion and imagination. Followers surrender critical thought not because they are weak, but because the narrative fills a void. The void of identity, the void of stability, the void of meaning in turbulent times. And leaders, ancient or modern, know exactly how to fill it. The consequences are profound. When charisma becomes a substitute for competence, governance becomes performative. Policies are judged by optics, not outcomes. Facts are judged by alignment with emotion, not evidence. Opposition is framed not as debate, but as betrayal. History provides the evidence. In Stalin's USSR, the cult justified purges, famines, and forced labor. In Mao's China, the myth masked disasters like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution.
In North Korea, the narrative sustained a state that exists almost entirely through belief, fear, and ritual. In the United States, Trump's rise revealed how even democratic institutions are vulnerable to psychology weaponized at scale. The modern twist is the speed and scale. Algorithms amplify outrage, echo chambers reinforce loyalty, and misinformation spreads faster than correction. The cult of personality in the digital age does not require imprisonment or censorship to maintain itself. It only requires attention, engagement, and emotional investment. Populism becomes performative, identity becomes transactional, and reality itself becomes negotiable. Citizens no longer simply follow policies, they follow myths. The state, media, and culture all converge to reinforce the narrative, and when reality conflicts with belief, belief often wins. The consequences are both societal and personal. Families divide, communities fracture, discourse collapses into vitriol. Institutions, once trusted as arbiters of truth, are treated as obstacles, and democracy, the delicate experiment of shared power, becomes vulnerable to manipulation not by guns or tanks, but by stories and emotions. The pattern repeats globally. In Brazil, Bolsonaro capitalized on nostalgia and anger, using social media to create a network of loyalists ready to defend, amplify, and mobilize. In India, Modi's charisma fused with religious symbolism to cultivate unwavering devotion. Across Africa, Asia, and Europe, leaders use media, spectacle, and mythology to shape identity and consolidate influence. The lesson is chillingly universal. The cult of personality is not confined to authoritarian regimes. Democracies, too, are susceptible. The mechanism is human, the vulnerability structural, and the consequences cumulative. Any system that grants attention the power to confer legitimacy is susceptible to myth. Political education, critical thinking, and independent media are not luxuries, they are shields. Yet even these are challenged by the speed of information, the emotional intensity of online platforms, and the innate human craving for narrative simplicity. The tension between charisma and competence is as old as leadership itself. The leader who captivates may not govern well. The policies that endure may not inspire devotion. And the paradox of the cult of personality is that its success is both the source of power and the source of peril. Stalin's charisma masked brutality. Mao's charm masked disaster. Trump's spectacle masked the fragility of institutions. Populist icons around the world reveal a pattern. Myth substitutes for scrutiny, emotion substitutes for reason, and loyalty substitutes for accountability. And in a world hyper-connected through screens and feeds, these substitutions happen faster and more thoroughly than ever before. The digital age accelerates myth-making while compressing time for reflection. Movements rise and entrench themselves in days. Myths solidify in hours, and narratives can dominate discourse before facts even have a chance to emerge. The democratic challenge is monumental. Leaders are no longer constrained by physical or political boundaries. Their influence travels through algorithms, across borders, and into private spaces. Citizens are constantly bombarded by curated reality, often more convincing than official reporting. The psychology of devotion works perfectly in this landscape. So where does this leave us? What does the future hold for the age of political myth? The rise of AI, deepfakes, and hyper-personalized media means that personality cults can now be manufactured at scale, automated, targeted, and adaptive. The leader may not even need to speak to every citizen directly. Synthetic voices, augmented reality, and algorithmic messaging can do it for them. Influence becomes a programmable commodity. The stakes are global. When devotion becomes digital and instantaneous, myths spread across borders, shaping elections, markets, and social movements. A leader in one country can now inspire loyalty or fear halfway around the globe.
The cult of personality is no longer just a national phenomenon. It is transnational, omnipresent, and persistent. And yet there is a countercurrent. Awareness, education, and critical media literacy are emerging as weapons of resistance. Movements of fact-checkers, investigative journalists, and civic educators challenge the myth-making machinery. The very tools that amplify personality can also illuminate it. The question for societies is not whether personality cults will emerge. They always will. The question is whether we recognize them, whether we understand the mechanics, and whether we resist the seductive simplicity of myth over substance. History teaches that myths can be persuasive, enduring, and dangerous. But history also teaches that knowledge, skepticism, and engagement can diminish their power. In the end, the cult of personality is both a mirror and a warning. It reflects our desires, fears, and vulnerabilities. It exploits the need for certainty and belonging. And it reminds us that leadership is not only about what is done in offices and parliaments, but also about what is believed in hearts and minds. The final lesson is cinematic, haunting, and urgent. In the age of mass media, social networks, and digital amplification, myth is as powerful as law, image as influential as ideology, and belief as binding as obedience. The story of Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung, Kennedy, Trump, and the global wave of populist leaders is not only history, it is prophecy. A warning to those who follow blindly, a challenge to those who lead carefully, and a mirror to all who consume media in search of truth. The future of political myth-making is not written in stone. It is scrolling on screens. It is trending in feeds. It is whispered in encrypted groups and amplified in viral clips. It is a story in which every citizen, every platform, every leader, and every belief plays a part. And as the screen light glows on our faces, we realize the myth is no longer something we observe. It is something we inhabit. The cult of personality has evolved, but its heart remains the same: human emotion, devotion, and the hunger for heroes. If you thought history was just in the textbooks, think again. From Stalin to Trump, the cult of personality has shaped the world we live in, and it's still evolving. Subscribe now to dive deeper into the hidden stories, the power behind the headlines, and the forces that shape our politics and culture. Hit the bell because the next chapter of history is unfolding, and you don't want to miss it.